Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about identifications and attachments. Before we get into the video, I want to hammer out a few definitions. Alright, so let's think about identity. So an identity is basically who you believe that you are. So when it comes to identification, that's a particular thing that we believe that we are. So let's say, for example, I believe myself to be a painter. And so I begin to identify with painting. And that way, let's say somebody comes and they insult painters and say painters are weird or something like that. Maybe I might feel a little slighted by that. Or if somebody says something positive about painters, like, oh, painters are really awesome, creative, intelligent people, I might feel a little bit elated from that identification. All right, so what is an attachment? An attachment is basically when you identify with something that you are not. So it's like you're adding something onto yourself that is not you. So conceptually, let's say I decide I'm a painter, but there's nothing in me that's a painter. You know, I might occasionally paint. In fact, I might spend my whole entire life painting. Maybe I paint from sunset to sunrise to sunset every day. But it still doesn't make me a painter, so that identification is actually a false identification. So with all of these identifications and with all of these attachments, they generally root back into a general narrative that we create around our lives. So since people are generally storytellers and we traffic a lot in conceptual understandings because of our strong intellect, we have a tendency to want to fit into a particular way in this story that we want to have turn out a particular way. So let's say, for example, I have in mind that I'm a painter and in my life I want to become a famous painter and to become extra good and gain respect, and that's how I want my story to go. So there's kind of like this linear push, like we think of ourselves like we're the protagonist of the story, and then we want things to turn out usually in a good way for us, or in some way that we perceive to be a good way for our story to end. So here's an example. Let's say that the narrative that I want my life to fit into is that I'm some international woman of mystery, like Carmen Sandiego or something like that. And I have this idea, this super romanticized idea in my head about how I'm going to travel from place to place and have all these different lovers and, you know, have all these different things happen within my life. And like, this is like my goal for my life. This is my narrative. And so I have this identification as this beautiful, mysterious woman. And then I have like all of these attachments, these things that I want to have happen. And, you know, it's basically this overarching fantasy for my life. So then when the rubber meets the road, like let's say I don't have a lot of money to travel, and let's say I'm maybe not quite as beautiful as all that, and maybe I'm not super mysterious, but I have all of these goals for how I want my life to go, you know, that's going to cause some struggle, that's going to cause some suffering. Now, this is kind of a little bit more of a fantastical sort of story that we create. You know, a lot of people's stories is a lot more subtle. Like, let's say, for example, I think, oh, you know, I have my own business and I really want to see my own business go well, and then I'll get a nice house, and, you know, then I'll be able to relax and I'll have these kind of luxuries and I'll have this sense of success. That's another one of those stories. That one's a little bit maybe more common. It's a little bit more subtle. But of course, with that narrative, you have a particular way that you want life to go. And so when you see that life isn't going that way, you struggle against it. But the problem with this struggle is that we can't just let it go, because we feel like our attachments and our identifications and this overarching narrative is going to pan out for us, that it's going to bring us some great sense of fulfillment. And of course, in these stories, maybe you might end up being that international woman of mystery, who knows? Or maybe you might end up being successful at your business and getting the house that you wanted, or, you know, maybe your story does work out. But nonetheless, there is no satisfaction to be found in this story, because there's always more wants. You know, the story has to keep going. Because if the story doesn't keep going, then who are you? If you're not the person struggling with the business to make it, who do you become then when you're so used to orienting yourself in that way? So attachments feel positive, but they are a big stumbling block for your happiness because attachments will never bring you fulfillment. And the fact of the matter is that these desired ends are really just ways to mitigate feelings of unworthiness, feelings of self-hatred, and an escape from emptiness to feel like life has a point. But as I've discussed in other videos, life doesn't actually have a point. Life just is what it is, and life is beautiful. But if you go around looking for meaning or significance or a point, you're not going to find any. So in light of this being the topic, before I talk about how to let go of attachments, which is something that I'm actively working on now, trying to just slough away little by little at each attachment that I have, as that's the way it kind of works. It's sort of a death of 1,000 cuts for each attachment. So before I go into the process, I want to tell you a little bit about my personal attachments. All right, now I have many little micro attachments. But I would say that all of these attachments root around 3 primary identifications. So my first identification is Emerald, the good person. My second identification is Emerald, the wise, intelligent, high achiever. And my third identification is Emerald, the beautiful young woman. Now, if you notice, all of these attachments that I mentioned are positive. Like, these are the identities that I have or I hope to match up to so that I might feel a sense of significance, a sense of worth, a sense of social value. So my first identification, and this one is probably the biggest one, it'll probably be the last one to go, is what I'm thinking, is Emerald, the good person. And basically, my whole entire life, I've identified myself as a good person, and I think, I do things that good people do, and I want everything to work out well for everyone, and I never get mad at anyone, and actually I don't dislike anyone because I'm beyond disliking people. And I'm so humble, and I have, and so the list goes on, and I have like all of these narratives that play out in my head about how, I'm such a good person because I'm so chilled out and, I don't get bothered by things and, I'm just so easygoing. Now, in terms of external actions, of course, that works out fine. I'm not hurting anyone, or at least not to my knowledge. I could potentially hurt someone with this identification too, but to my knowledge, I'm not. But the problem is that this internally ties my hands. Because essentially, if you identify very strongly with being a good person, you're not going to have a high degree of awareness. Because anything that comes into your mind that's a little negative, like let's say you get a little angry, or maybe you feel a feeling of lust towards someone who's not your partner, or maybe you feel like just this murderous urge come up and you immediately have to block out that. So essentially, what you're doing is you're living in a very small area of your mind where all the safe thoughts are, where all the safe emotions are. And you're essentially saying that all these other emotions are not okay. And so this is a pattern habitually that I've been in, is actively suppressing the negative, not wanting to face my negative side. Now, if I'm to wonder where this identification comes from, it probably comes from many places. In every single children's story, the good person, they end up on top, and then the bad people end up pretty much kind of getting flushed down the toilet. They end up getting killed, or, something negative happens to them. And essentially everyone agrees that it's all for the best, that bad things happen to them. And so, because I want to feel worthwhile and I want to feel significant and I want people to admire me and smile upon me, I have this strong identification. But it's not a selfless identification. It's a very selfish kind of, like, I want people to orient toward me a particular way. And deep down there's this fear of not being valid. And subtly, now if I identify as a good person, I might not pick up on this. But subtly, there's this judgment of other people that I see that are doing things that are less than good. Not even necessarily bad, but just a little bit less than good. Like, let's say someone tells a white lie, then I get to feel superior. Like, I'm a good person. I don't tell white lies, And then, of course, I can feel contempt toward people who do terrible things. Or maybe I might even think, oh, I'm such a good person that I can even accept people who do terrible things. And, so in this way, the ego is very, very tricky, and it hooks you in through these self-congratulatory thoughts. And basically, it just keeps me up, this particular identification and all my other ones keep me from feeling a sense of inferiority, because that's what I'm afraid of, is to feel inferior. All right, my second identification is Emerald, the hardworking, industrious, wise, high achiever. So this is like all of my positive traits relative to being competent. So like basically, if I were to boil this one down, it's having high aptitude. So far I want to be good and I want to have high aptitude. And so essentially, with this one, I have this underlying feeling like people who maybe aren't as intelligent or aren't as wise or aren't as aware or aren't as fill in the blank trait, whatever good trait that I happen to perceive myself as having. Anybody who doesn't have that, I get to feel like, oh, maybe they're not as worthwhile as I am. And maybe, after all, maybe I am worthwhile. Maybe I'm significant. And see, the problem here is that I still have this belief in significance, even though significance doesn't actually exist. And essentially, in order to be significant by my unconscious definition of significance, other people have to be insignificant. And so this identification serves me because I can think, oh, look at me, I know so much, and oh, look how cool I am because I can figure this thing out, or I can do this, and those people can't. And so there's a step down there, Clearly I'm the one that stands out, And I mean, this can be done with any kind of special talent. Oftentimes many identifications come along with that. Like, let's say I was the best car mechanic, or in my mind I was the best car mechanic, and I think, oh, I'm the best car mechanic. All these other people, they just don't know their job as well as me, And oh, car mechanicery, by the way, is the best career, so I'm the best in the best career. So there's always this trying to set apart, and I'm pretty sure that this is a common thing. I don't think I'm the only one. I've only ever experienced my thoughts, so I don't know. But essentially, I get to think, oh, I'm one up. But then, of course, because of my previous identification as Emerald the good person, this kind of gets repressed down a little bit below the surface, because if I think I'm better than someone for being more intelligent than them, well, that's not a very good person kind of trait. And so this is the type of internal mindset that I might choose to ignore, and I might choose to block out, because one identification sort of interferes with the other identification. And so it's a very tricky web of lies that I essentially have to kind of protect in order to keep these identifications up. There's like, I'm enslaved to these identifications. All right, my third identification, and I tend to judge this as a little bit shallow, at least the part of me that identifies as a good person. I also have this identification of Emerald, the attractive young woman. And this one probably causes me the most grief, because number one, I don't like the fact that I have this identification, because it interferes with my primary identification of being a good person. But also, it's like I don't know what to do with this one. There's some kind of fulfillment that I'm seeking through it that, I can never feel like I have. So I think this is a pretty common mindset of many other women that I've talked to, over the years, and even back into my teen years. There's always this, oh, am I pretty? Am I not pretty? Am I, and then you feel different ways on different days. And, essentially this takes up a lot of mind space, and it's a very heavy, burdensome identification to carry around. And this likely comes from a lot of sources too, and essentially at some point I came up with the idea, or I internalized the idea, that in order to be more significant, in order to be worthwhile, I have to be attractive as a woman. And so I also have this little shadow judgment back there that, oh, unattractive women aren't as valuable as attractive women, or they're not as significant, or they don't deserve as much attention or admiration. And these, of course, are embarrassing mindsets to have and embarrassing mindsets to admit to having. Like, I feel a little uncomfortable even admitting it. But nonetheless, this is part of my identification, and so there's a lot of shadow material around this one. So those are my 3 major identity attachments. Now, these are very, very difficult to uproot because they have a lot of concepts attached to them. They have a lot of extra attachments. Like, for example, Emerald the good person even has like, oh, then I have to be a good mom. I have to act this way. I have to do that. Or like, if let's say I focus too much on, oh, Emerald the attractive young woman, well, that's a big pain in the butt because then I'm undermining the Emerald the good person one. So these things are very convoluted, very complex, and they have a lot of little micro attachments attached to them. But if I look down at the roots of all of these, they all connect in one area. And that's that I'm using these identity attachments to feel a sense of significance and a sense of worth. And so beyond that attachment, there's this idea that there's this person named Emerald in here that needs some confirmation of worth there. There's this idea that I am this individual, and if I don't somehow prove my worth to the world, then I'm not worth anything, and it's not valid for me to be here. And so, even though these attachments seem fairly mundane, I'm essentially battling with myself every day just to feel baseline okay. Otherwise I feel inferior. I feel like it's not okay for me to take up space. So these 3 identities, like the main core of them, there's a lot of little like mini identifications that branch off of them. And these little mini identifications impact every decision that I make in life. And they can cloud my judgment a lot. So for example, let's say that there's a situation where I can choose to either do the right thing or seem like I'm doing the right thing. That identification of Emerald the good person might be tempted to choose to do the thing that seems right but isn't right. So this is something that I struggled with a lot when I was teaching, is that, so sometimes I was in a position where I had to put my foot down about things and say, no, this is not okay. But there was this feeling like, I'm going to be perceived as being a negative person in this situation. And so there's this temptation there to let things slide and to not stand up for what's right or what's supposed to happen. So all of these positive identifications are essentially my mind and everything warring against this feeling of being not worthwhile or not valid. So, well, I don't feel valid, then, look, I'm a good person. It's okay for me to be here. Or, I'm inferior. Well, no, I'm not, because look at all these achievements and look at all of these things that I can do and look at all these abilities that I have toward this or toward that. Or, well, I'm not worthwhile. Well, maybe I can get attention through being attractive. Look at me. Well, come hither, look, whatever. So all of these things are to mitigate this self-hatred and feeling of inferiority. So these identities guard those negative feelings about myself. So I can lie to myself and say, look at me. I feel good. I'm happy with who I am. I'm an awesome person. Look at all this stuff going on with me. I'm really doing up this life thing real good. But of course, all of these identifications are a farce. And even my identification as Emerald Wilkins is a farce. Because I'm not just Emerald Wilkins, I'm that which perceives everything in my field of awareness. And that thing doesn't need anything to justify its existence. No concept within the field of awareness can negate that existence. And there's no justification for it, it just is. And so essentially, when I had my experiences of ego transcendence, that's how I felt. Like, I'm valid. I don't have to prove my worth to anyone. I don't have to care about these things at all. I can just be as I am, and I don't have to worry about a thing because nothing could ever invalidate me. I'm not significant. I'm not insignificant. I'm not worthy. I'm not worthless. All of those are just ideas. They cannot contain me. But identity attachments can be many. So it could be a career, it could be a religion, it could be the race or ethnic group that you belong to, your gender, some sort of a special identity. Like, let's say, for example, like you are a junkie, you know, and that's become part of your identity. And so whenever somebody says, oh, you shouldn't do drugs, you know, maybe you feel a little slighted, or, you know, maybe you feel a little elated when somebody says something positive about somebody who does drugs, or, you know, whatever the case may be. That's just like one example out of many. You know, or let's say that you identify yourself with being a woman, and so, you know, whenever there's the case that somebody makes a slight remark on, like, let's say people say, oh, women talk too much, and then you feel offended because you identify with the idea that you're a woman, and you think, oh, you know, hey, that doesn't resemble me. So the nature of ego is to give you both self-congratulatory thoughts and self-deprecating thoughts. And so it'll give you thoughts 1 minute like, oh, check me out, look at how aware I am because I'm so into spirituality and I'm so wise and I have all of these things going for me. And you know what, I bet if, you know, somebody could somehow see that I'm so wise and aware, you know, they'd be really impressed at that. And, you know, maybe I would please this, that, or the other person, and they would admire me because I have this particular trait or that particular trait. And so that's one side of it. But then there's also the self-deprecating thoughts like, oh, no one understands me. Nobody's ever going to get it. You know, I'm like basically like a child in a grown-up's body, you know, and everybody's so different from me. And, you know, oh, woe is me, woe is me. You know, so the ego gives both of these thoughts, and they're constantly at war. They're always struggling up against one another. And so these identifications, these positive identifications, you know, are basically fighting up against your negative identifications. All right, so I'll give you a 3-step process for breaking down your attachments. So the first thing is to become aware of what your big attachments are. So you might have a lot of little attachments. Write those down too, you know, set it aside on a separate sheet of paper, but really come up with like what all those identifications like are around. So maybe if you're a spiritual seeker, maybe you have an ego identification with spirituality itself. It's always possible, you know. So maybe you think, oh, I'm a wise person, and maybe that's like what your identification is. Or maybe you have the same thing as me, where you think you're a good person. Or like a common identity that I see a lot, you know, online is like there's this idea of the alpha male, and so there's like this community of guys who want to be like the alpha male. Like, so that's one of those identities. You know, whatever your main 3 identities are, and then start to look for why it is that you cling so much to those identities. What is it giving you? So what's the reason down underneath all things? Like, what do you think you're trying to get away from? Because with all these identifications, there's something that you're trying to get away from. You're either trying to get away from feeling meaningless or insignificant or pointless, worthless. You know, many of these fears, that's the reason why these sort of guard identities, these positive identities come up. Also, the second thing is to find out positively what you want from your identities. So, for example, I want to be seen as a good person so that people admire me for being a good person. Or also, like, maybe I admire myself for being a good person. Like, it doesn't always have to be for the eyes of others. You know, sometimes we want to look at ourselves in a good light so that we could actually, like, love ourselves for that moment. So, you know, a lot of it is, you know, I want to feel like I can love myself. Or maybe we want to feel special in some way, like, oh, look at me, I'm a great dancer, you know, so maybe I have this identification as a dancer, and like that's my thing that I think makes me a special person. Or maybe I'm a rocket scientist and I'm extra smart or successful, or like whatever the case may be. You know, all of those things come, you know, because you want to feel special, because you want to feel like there's something extraordinary about you, something that makes you stand out from the rest. Our nature is to put value judgments over reality and to figure out what's worthwhile and what's not. And so we want to make sure that we ourselves are in the valuable pile. We want to make sure that we wouldn't cast ourselves aside in our own judgments. And you see this type of value judgment being placed over things from large to small. So maybe we think, oh yeah, well, Earth is the most important planet, and of course humanity is the most important species and the smartest and whatever kind of species on the planet. And then, you know, maybe my race is like really the best race in the whole species, that is humanity. And then of course within the race, you know, like my social group, my particular family, you know, clearly we're superior to everyone else within the race. And then within my social group, of course, you know, me and my closest family and friends, you know, we're the best. And out of them, of course, I'm the best. And so we can really start, you know, seeing how it is that we come to feel so disconnected from everything. We start to feel very cut off and lonely because we're always having to somehow prove our worth by setting ourselves aside. All right, the third step of the process is to starve your attachments. So essentially, if you look at your firsthand experience, you have your sensory fields, you know, your five senses, and you have your thoughts. And within the sensations that you feel in your body, you know, that's where you experience your emotions, that coupled with the thoughts in your mind. And so essentially, these attachments come whenever your thoughts have a particular emotional charge to them, a particular emotional power that makes you feel identified with them. So when you feel these thoughts come up, don't try to resist them, don't try to stop them. Like let's say me, okay, as Emerald the good person, it's like, oh, I'm such an awesome person, look how humble I am. You know, of course, the ego is tricky, it can even convince itself that it's humble. You know, so it's like, oh, I'm a good person, look how humble I am. You know, maybe my first instinct would be, oh, wait a second, let me repress that down because that actually goes against my identification. But don't do that. Just let the thought rise up and just watch it just as it is. Don't get involved in it. Don't identify with the thought. Just view it like it was something happening out here in your visual field. You know, like let's say you're watching a sunset. Watching a sunset is the same way that you want to watch your thoughts come up because you essentially don't have very much control over your thoughts, if any at all. And so basically you want to watch your internal phenomena the same way that you would watch your external phenomena, because if you're familiar, you'll know that internal and external is actually a false distinction. It's a false dichotomy. And so when you're looking into things like that, you want to make sure that you treat your internal happenings the same as you would treat external happenings. So you just, whenever those thoughts come up, whenever those feelings come up where you're identifying with an attachment, don't say, oh no, I shouldn't be identifying with that. Keep that away. That's ego, and ego is bad. Let's keep ego away. No, allow the ego. Allow that process to happen, because essentially the ego is a process. You can't really hide it. It just happens. And so just allow it to come into your awareness, and eventually you're going to be able to start zooming out further and further and further from those thoughts and those feelings. And when you can zoom out far enough, that's when they start to fall away. All right, so as a recap, when it comes to identity and attachment, you want to really scour your internal experience for these thoughts and ideas that have an emotional pull over you. Things that if somebody else insulted those things, you would feel slighted by. And then once you know your main attachments, then you want to starve those attachments out. You want to just watch them. Don't get involved with them. Don't struggle with them. Don't repress them. Don't identify with them. Just watch them. And essentially, you can start to see how those things can never bring you fulfillment. Alright, so that's all I have for you today. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe. Leave me a comment down below. Also, if you know somebody who might enjoy this video, go ahead and share the video with them. And I will continue to post more videos. I'm sorry for not posting last Saturday because I had to evacuate for Hurricane Matthew, but it should be every Saturday from here on out. That's my goal, is to post a video at least every Saturday. I also have some more collaboration videos coming up if you're interested in that. I'm going to be doing a collaboration video filming this Sunday. I'm going to be collaborating with a Rally from Naked Reality, so there you can look forward to that. Also, I have another channel that I'm going to be collaborating with Dr. Heath from Vinculo, so you can look forward to that too. He's a Freudian analyst, so that should be pretty interesting. All right, so that's all I have for you today. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and until next time, keep becoming more you.